Letters from the 40s. From a man we never knew. 2 letters fell to the kitchen floor when I was taking out old pots from the upper cabinet in my grandmother's house. The house had been empty for 6 months since her death, and I'd finally decided to sort through her belongings. The envelopes were yellowed with time, bearing postmarks from August and September 1943. Each had the same sender's name, Jonathan R. Mitchell. I'd never heard this name in our family. The first letter began with the words, "My dear Ellie, I think about our time together every minute." Those 2 weeks flew by like a single day, but they changed my entire life. What followed were lines about how the author missed her laughter, their evening walks, their conversations until dawn. The letter ended with a promise, "Wait for me, darling. The war can't last forever. I'll come back and take you with me to California, where we'll build the house of our dreams." The second letter was dated 3 weeks later and sounded more desperate. "Ellie, why aren't you answering my letters? I've written 5 times already. Maybe the letters aren't getting through? Or have you changed your mind? I'm begging you, write me at least a line. Tell me our feelings were real. I'm ready to wait for you as long as it takes." In this letter lay a photograph of a young man in military uniform with an inscription on the back, "To Ellie with love, August 1943, your Jonathan." The man in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to my father in his youth. The same deep-set eyes, the same determined chin, the same way of slightly raising his left eyebrow. But why had my grandmother kept these letters for 80 years? And who was Jonathan Mitchell? Grandpa Robert had died 10 years ago. He was my grandmother Eleanor's only husband. At least that's what we'd always been told. They married in October 1943, right after his return from the war. They had 4 children. My father, Thomas, in 1944, Uncle Michael in 1946, Aunt Susan in 1948, and youngest Uncle David in 1952. I photographed the letters and the picture, but didn't show them to anyone yet. I needed to figure out what this meant first. The next day, I went to the Multnomah County Archives. If this Jonathan Mitchell had really existed, there should be some traces left. Jonathan Raymond Mitchell, born 1919, drafted into the Army in June 1942, served in the Engineering Corps, received short leave in August 1943 in Portland. After leave, sent to the Pacific Front, discharged in November 1946 in San Francisco. So he really had been in Portland in August 1943, 2 months before my grandmother's wedding to Grandpa Robert. I asked the archivist to find records of Jonathan Mitchell's death. He died in 1987 in Los Angeles. The obituary mentioned a wife, Dorothy, and 2 children, Michael and Susan Mitchell. At home, I began carefully studying the family chronology. Grandmother and Grandpa Robert had been engaged before the war. Grandpa left for the front in February 1943. He returned in September 1943 after being wounded. The wedding took place in October 1943, and my father was born in May 1944, 7 months after the wedding. But 8 months after Grandpa's return, and exactly 9 months after August 1943, Grandmother always said that my father was born premature, a 7-month baby. She explained his small birth weight. But in childhood photos, my father looked like a full-term baby. I decided to show my findings to my father. His reaction was strange. He was silent for a long time, studying Jonathan's photograph. My father said he'd always felt somewhat different from the other children in the family. Uncle Michael, Aunt Susan, and Uncle David were copies of Grandpa Robert, cheerful, outgoing, athletic. But my father was serious, inclined toward exact sciences, loved reading and building things. Grandmother explained this by saying he was born weak and therefore developed differently. But now there was another explanation. I told him about my suspicions carefully. My father listened, but asked me not to tell anyone else until we were certain. The other relatives reacted negatively to my attempts to ask about family history. When I hinted to Uncle Michael about finding old letters, he abruptly cut off the conversation. He said there was no need to dig up the past and that I should focus on my own life instead of rummaging through family archives. Aunt Susan was even more categorical. She accused me of trying to dishonor our mother's memory for the sake of gossip. Uncle David simply asked me to leave the family alone. But my doubts persisted. The resemblance between my father and the man in the photograph was too obvious. And why would grandmother keep letters from a stranger for 80 years? I decided to act independently, without involving the family in the search details. Through social media, I found Michael Mitchell in Los Angeles. I wrote a careful message introducing myself as a family genealogy researcher. I said I'd found mentions of Jonathan Mitchell in connection with Portland in the 1940s. Michael responded a few days later. He confirmed that his father had served in the engineering corps and had leave in Portland in the summer of 1943. After the war, he moved to California, where he married their mother. His father sometimes mentioned that there was a girl in Portland whom he loved, but she married someone else while he was fighting. He didn't share more details. I decided to be direct and sent Michael a photograph of my father. I asked if he saw any family resemblance. The answer came a week later. Michael was stunned. The resemblance was indeed striking. He asked me to explain where I got this photograph and who this person was. I told the whole story, about the letters I'd found, the dates, my suspicions. Michael initially refused to believe it. It seemed impossible to him. His father had never mentioned a child. But the thought haunted him. A month later, Michael wrote again. He couldn't get it out of his head. The resemblance really was remarkable, and the age fit. He suggested doing a DNA test to know the truth for certain. I agreed, but warned that I hadn't told my family about our correspondence yet. But events took an unexpected turn. While I was corresponding with Michael, another discovery occurred in grandmother's house. Going through the basement, I found an old box with wartime documents. Among them was a strange find, a letter addressed not to grandmother, but to her mother, my great-grandmother Mary. A letter was dated October 1943 and signed Jonathan Mitchell. Dear Mrs. Carter, I received your letter and understand your position. Eleanor is indeed engaged to a worthy man, and I have no right to interfere in her life. I apologize for the trouble I've caused your family. I won't write any more. So, grandmother's parents had indeed intervened and written to Jonathan to leave their daughter alone. But what struck me in the letter, Jonathan mentioned some special circumstances that had made him contact Eleanor's family. If my suspicions are correct, then I have the right to know the truth. But since you assure me that I'm wrong, I accept your words. What suspicions? What had he guessed? I continued studying the documents and found another oddity. In grandmother's wartime medical records, there were discrepancies. A December 1943 certificate indicated that grandmother had consulted a doctor about women's ailments. But in the doctor's notes was a strange comment. Patient insists on confidentiality. Husband must not know about the visit. Why was grandmother hiding a doctor visit from Grandpa Robert in December 1943? They married in October. They should have shared everything. Unless she already knew she was pregnant and was afraid the doctor would reveal the wrong dates. And in a March 1944 certificate, another doctor recorded pregnancy proceeding normally, 20 weeks along. If it was 20 weeks in March, then conception occurred in November 1943, a month after the wedding. But the December certificate hinted that grandmother already knew about the pregnancy then. The medical documents contradicted each other. Someone was lying, either the first doctor, the second doctor, or grandmother herself had asked for wrong dates to be recorded. Meanwhile, Michael came to Portland. We met at a cafe and exchanged all the materials we had. Michael brought photographs of his father from different years and several documents. Among them was a diary that Jonathan had kept in his final years. The entries showed that Michael's father had indeed never forgotten his Portland love. In a 1985 entry, he wrote, 42 years have passed since I last saw Ellie. I wonder what became of her. Is she happy? Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd tried to fight for her. And in a 1986 entry was something more specific. I had a strange dream today. Ellie was holding a little boy with my eyes. I woke up with a heavy feeling. Could it be that back then, in August, Jonathan suspected the possibility that he might have had a child, but he was never certain? Michael showed me another diary his father had kept in the 1950s. August 15th, 1954. 11 years ago today, I first met Ellie. I can't get the thought out of my head. What if back then, in August? But no, her parents wrote me clearly that she was engaged before our meeting. The child must have been born at the proper time after their wedding. May 22nd, 1958. I had a strange dream. A boy about 14, very much like me at that age. I woke up with a heavy feeling. Ellie, if we'd had a son, he'd be just 14 now. August 10th, 1962. I met a soldier on the street who'd served with me in Portland in 43. I asked if he knew what had become of the local families. He said the Clark family was doing well. The eldest son became an engineer, works on a big construction project. Strange, but somehow those words made my heart clench. The boy chose the same profession as me. June 5th, 1968. I learned that young Clark got married. A nice girl, they say. They'll have children. Strange, but I feel something like paternal pride. Though what business is it of mine with a stranger's family? October 12th, 1970. Thomas Clark had a daughter. Why do I remember these dates? Why do I care? It turned out Jonathan had unconsciously tracked the life of the person who might be his son. His paternal instincts worked even when his mind refused to accept the possibility of kinship. The entries showed that Jonathan had been tormented by doubts his whole life, but never dared to check his suspicions. He was afraid of destroying someone else's happiness with his questions. We submitted DNA samples to a private laboratory. Waiting for the results was agonizing. If the test showed kinship, it would overturn both families' understanding of their history. The result came 2 weeks later. The probability that Michael and I were related as uncle and niece was 99.2%. My father really did have a half-brother in California, whom he'd never known about. Now I had to tell my father the truth. When I showed him the test results and told him about my correspondence with Michael, my father first went pale. Then he was silent for a long time, looking through Jonathan's photographs. The resemblance was undeniable, not just physical, but in character, inclinations, and mannerisms. My father understood why he'd always felt special in the family, why he'd been drawn to engineering, even though Grandpa Robert worked in a completely different field. So Mom had kept a secret her whole life. Just imagine what a burden she'd carried for 80 years. But my father also felt heavy, realizing that his real father had died without ever knowing about his son's existence. That they could have known each other, communicated, shared experiences. My father had always considered himself Robert Clark's son, was proud of it, looked up to him, and suddenly it turned out his biological father was a man from California who died not suspecting his son's existence. Gradually the shock passed, and my father wanted to learn more about Jonathan. Michael came to Portland again, now as my father's half-brother. From documents and stories, it became clear that Jonathan was a good man. He worked as an engineer, built roads and bridges in California. Married late, was a loving husband and father to Michael and Susan. His father often said that the most important thing in life was family. He worried that he had few relatives and dreamed of a large family. And he had an eldest son in Oregon whom he never knew about. Susan, Jonathan's daughter, also came to Portland. She brought several more of her father's diaries and said that he'd kept a photograph of some girl until the end of his life. After their father's death, the children found a snapshot in his wallet, a young woman in a summer dress. Now it became clear that this was my grandmother. Jonathan had carried a photograph of his first love in his wallet for 40 years. My father listened to these stories with sadness and joy at the same time. It was sad to learn that his biological father had yearned for family his whole life when it was so close. But it was joyful to understand that Jonathan was a worthy man to be proud of. Gradually, my father began finding traits in Jonathan's story that he recognized in himself. Love of exact sciences, inclination toward design, calm character, attachment to family values. It was interesting to observe how genes manifest even without upbringing. My father became an engineer without knowing he was following in his biological father's footsteps. But the most amazing discovery was yet to come. Michael brought from Los Angeles another diary his father had kept, which he'd found during the final house cleaning. In the 1950s diary were entries that shed light on the doubts that tormented Jonathan. August 15th, 1954. 11 years ago today, I first met Ellie. I can't get the thought out of my head. What if back then in August? But no, her parents wrote me clearly that she was engaged before our meeting. The child must have been born at the proper time after their wedding. May 22nd, 1958. I had a strange dream. A boy about 14, very much like me at that age. I woke up with a heavy feeling. Ellie, if we'd had a son, He'd be just 14 now. August 10th, 1962. I met a soldier on the street who'd served with me in Portland in '43. I asked if he knew what had become of the local families. He said the Clark family was doing well. The eldest son became an engineer. Works on a big construction project. Strange, but somehow those words made my heart clench. The boy chose the same profession as me. June 5th, 1968. I learned that young Clark got married. A nice girl, they say. They'll have children. Strange, but I feel something like paternal pride. Though what business is it of mine with a stranger's family? October 12th, 1970. Thomas Clark had a daughter. Why do I remember these dates? Why do I care? It turned out Jonathan had unconsciously tracked the life of the person who might be his son. His paternal instincts worked even when his mind refused to accept the possibility of kinship. The entries showed that Jonathan had been tormented by doubts his whole life, but never dared to check his suspicions. He was afraid of destroying someone else's happiness with his questions. But the most important discovery happened after all these events. While cleaning out the last things from grandmother's house, I found a hidden drawer in the old writing desk. In it lay a folder with newspaper clippings. All the clippings were from California newspapers from different years. Articles about construction projects in Los Angeles mentioning engineer Jonathan Mitchell. Jonathan's obituary from 1987. Even a notice about his daughter Susan's wedding in 1975. Grandmother had followed Jonathan's life her entire life. The folder also contained grandmother's own notes. Dates of important events in the Mitchell family's life, copied from newspaper mentions. 1962. Jonathan received award for bridge project. 1975. Daughter Susan got married. 1978. Son Michael became an architect. 1987. Jonathan died of cancer. After the last entry was a date 1 week later. Ordered memorial service at St. Paul's Church. Grandmother had ordered a memorial service for the man she'd loved 80 years ago. But most amazing, in the folder lay a subscription to the California newspaper Los Angeles Times, started in 1960 and renewed every year until grandmother's death. For 40 years, she'd subscribed to a newspaper from another state to read news about the life of a man she'd last seen in 1943. Now we had to decide what to do with the rest of the family. Uncle Michael, Aunt Susan, and Uncle David had always considered my father their full brother. Should we tell them the truth or not? After long deliberation, my father decided to be honest. The family had the right to know the truth, however difficult it might be. The reaction was predictable. The relatives wondered why we dug into the past. Mom hadn't kept the secret for no reason. She must not have wanted anyone to know about it. Uncle Michael said this information only complicated life. Why stir up what had been buried 80 years ago? Aunt Susan was cold to us for several months. She felt we'd betrayed our mother's memory by revealing what she'd carefully hidden. Uncle David took it more calmly, but also didn't understand the need to dig up the past. For them, my father would always remain their brother, regardless of biological nuances. They'd grown up together, supported each other their whole lives. Why change anything? Gradually, the passions subsided. The family accepted the new reality as a given. Uncle Michael even met the California Mitchells and acknowledged the striking resemblance. Everyone agreed that grandmother had carried a heavy burden her whole life. Keeping such a secret for 80 years without telling anyone required incredible willpower. My father established warm relationships with Jonathan's family. Michael and Susan Mitchell became his real half-brother and sister. They shared family stories, showed photographs, told about the man who connected them all. It was especially touching to learn details about Jonathan's character. It turned out he and my father were similar, not just in appearance. Jonathan also loved getting up early and working in the garden. Also didn't like noisy parties, preferring quiet family evenings. Also had the habit of fixing everything with his own hands and never throwing away things that could still be repaired. Michael said his father always emphasized the importance of education. He insisted the children study mathematics and natural sciences. He said engineering thinking would help them in any profession. And my father, without knowing it, had passed these same values to his children. We all got technical educations and work in fields related to exact sciences. It's amazing how not only genes, but life principles are transmitted, even when there's no direct communication between generations. Susan brought another family heirloom, a ring that Jonathan had worn his whole life. A simple gold ring with an engraved date, 1508-1943, the date of his first meeting with grandmother. Jonathan had ordered this ring in the 1950s and wore it on his right pinky finger. The children thought it was just a beautiful piece of jewelry. Only now did it become clear that this was a memory of the most important 2 weeks of his life. My father took the ring and studied the engraving for a long time. For the first time, he held an object that had belonged to his biological father. We went to Los Angeles to visit Jonathan's grave, a simple granite headstone with the inscription, Jonathan Raymond Mitchell, 1919 to 1987. Loving husband and father. My father placed a bouquet of roses on the grave and stood in silence. For the first time in his life, he was near his biological father. Michael showed us the rose bushes in the garden that his father had planted in the 1960s. These were exactly the same roses that grandmother had grown in Portland. The Double Delight variety. White petals with red edges. Coincidence? Or had Jonathan deliberately chosen the variety that reminded him of home in Oregon? Returning home, we had a family dinner. At the table sat children of one man who'd grown up in different states, with different surnames, but with similar facial features and character. Uncle Michael, who'd initially resisted revealing family secrets, now questioned the California relatives with interest. Aunt Susan said that Mom would have been happy about such a reunion, and my father just sat and looked at this picture with quiet happiness. At 78, he'd gained new brothers and sisters. Now, a year later, our families live as one. Every August 15th, we gather together in memory of Jonathan and grandmother's first meeting. Last year, we planted a Double Delight rose bush in my father's garden. Now the same roses that grew in Jonathan's and grandmother's gardens bloom in Portland. And in the kitchen, in that same cabinet where I found the letters, now stands a photograph of all of Jonathan Mitchell's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The large family he'd so wanted to have. The story that began with 2 yellowed letters showed us that family is not just blood, but choice. The choice to love, forgive, accept, and remember. Jonathan and Eleanor loved each other for 2 weeks in August 1943. But their love was so strong that it continues to live in their descendants to this day. Such is the power of true feelings. They don't disappear with time, but are passed on from generation to generation, connecting people with invisible threads of kinship and memory. 2 wartime letters changed the lives of 2 families and showed that the most important thing you can leave behind is not money or property, but love that will warm people's hearts long after your own heart stops beating.